Thank you, everybody, for coming today. I think we've got a great discussion planned for you. We're going to make it sort of freewheeling, not too many, planned or canned questions. And if we want to open it up to questions towards the end, feel free to chime in. I'm Jim Acosta, I work for CNN. To my left, we could just do our own introductions. Monica, you start first.
Sure. Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Monica Alba. I am a White House correspondent for NBC News here in Washington. I started out as a producer, working and covering different kinds of political campaigns. I ended up at the White House. My first real day as a White House producer was day one of the Trump administration. So the next 4 years were certainly a wild ride to cover, as my colleagues can certainly attest to, and very important journalism that was underway, of course, day in and day out. And then from there, I have been a White House correspondent since day one of the Biden administration. So I get to cover all of the different aspects. As we all know, when you cover the White House, you are basically a mini expert in many, many different subjects. You're covering foreign policy one day, major domestic issues, major issues on the Hill, government shutdowns, the debt ceiling crisis, and a million other things in between. So it's a really, really important honor that I am able to do that. And I am so happy to be here with you all. And I'll pass it over to Claudia.
Claudia Grisales. I'm a congressional correspondent for National Public Radio. I got to DC about 5 years ago and started working for NPR about 4 years ago. Before that, I was based in Texas. I worked for a daily newspaper in Austin, Texas for about 15 years. I covered business news, news at the state legislature, and as well as a little public safety in there too. And came out here. I wasn't sure if I wanted to stick in journalism. I was very burned out by the time I did. And so 6 months later, the itch hit me again. I applied for a bunch of random jobs, including Stars and Stripes, the military website, which had an office just a few floors below us. And they hired me in about 20 minutes. So I thought, okay, this doesn't sound so bad, only 20 minutes. And so I did a hit for NPR about a year in, and NPR reached out and said, would you like to be, on our team here covering the Capitol? And I was super intimidated, but so far it's worked out, and here I am. I'll pass it on to Ed.
My name is Ed O'Keefe. I'm getting over a little cold that my 7-year-old oddly was proud to give me. So if I sound a little different than usual, that's why. Some of you probably walked in here thinking, why did they invite an O'Keefe? Let me clarify. My mother is the Lopez from Guatemala. My dad's the O'Keefe from Massachusetts. So proud. I'm a good cup of coffee. I think that's one way you can put it. Senior White House and political correspondent for CBS News, which essentially means I cover the guy who lives there now and everybody else who'd like to. Or the issues beyond Washington that sometimes merit our attention. Have been with CBS now about 5.5 years. Came on first as a political correspondent who covered primarily the Biden and others' campaigns, and then went into the White House when he started. And before that, spent nearly 13 years at the Washington Post, covering everything from, first as a website producer back in 2007, 2008, so covered all those campaigns, which was an incredible year and cycle to cover. And then spent 4 years covering federal agencies here in Washington, basically every agency or issue generated by those agencies and departments that didn't have a full-time beat reporter for the Washington Post, and the people who worked at them. So it was like covering the auto workers or the stagehands in Hollywood. I was covering the rank and file federal workforce, which also happens to buy newspapers, so it was an important beat for the Post. But through that was spending a lot more time on Capitol Hill and ended up wanting to cover Congress and spent about 5 years there. And throughout all of this was starting to do a lot more television and radio and realized that people kept calling back, which is usually a sign they like what you're doing and saying. And I began to realize I preferred doing journalism that way. So one thing led to another. First as a contributor at CBS News after many years on MSNBC and CNN and occasionally on NPR. And then about a year later, they hired me full time, and here we are. The rest is history. So.
And I also want to give a shout out to the National Hispanic Foundation for the Arts for having us here today, and Felix, who has been organizing this great event year after year. Did I hear correctly? This is 30 years? Now 27 years. We're almost to 30 years. Congratulations to you, Felix. What an achievement. Ed kind of got us going in the direction I wanted to go, which is to sort of hear from each of our panelists about how you got to this point, because you just didn't beam down from a spaceship and then start suddenly covering the White House. I mean, I'll kind of go first a little bit. I started off in local news. I did it the old-fashioned way, made my way up to CBS and then CNN. But my very first job in television was just answering the phones here at Channel 5 in Washington. That was pretty much right out of college. And back in those days, I might be going over the heads of some of our younger audience members here, but one of my colleagues was the wife of Sam Donaldson. And so occasionally Sam Donaldson would call the newsroom and, "Hello, can I speak to Jan Smith? I want to speak to my wife, please. Hurry up." And that would be basically the phone call. I drop the phone. "Yes, Mr. Donaldson, hold on a second." That was my introduction to television news, basically, and it kind of went from there. But I only tell that because, for some of our younger audience members who, they come out of college, "Why am I not on the network right now? I should be hosting the Today Show. My mom says I'm great. Why is this not happening?" It does take a little time to get there. Speaking of which, Monica Alba, she has worked her way up the ladder in this business, earned her position at the White House, and now is doing it for NBC News, which is quite a gig. Tell us how you got there.
Thank you. And I do always like to tell people that your career and your path is going to zig and zag so many times, and it's never linear, and that is totally okay. When I started out, I thought I wanted to do sports journalism. I thought I wanted to do investigative reporting. I looked at different things that I liked consuming and thought, oh, maybe that's what I want to do. And it was only through the course of trying different things and getting mentors and seeing people in the field and how they were working that I was able to figure out what I ultimately wanted to do. And so when you're at your starting point, when people ask you that question of like, where do you see yourself in 5 years? I don't like that question, because it's like, I have no idea. I hope I'm somewhere that is building upon what I'm doing right now, and maybe there will be like 5 different stones and stepping paths along the way, and maybe it'll be totally different, and all of that I'm here to say is okay. So just trust your gut and your instincts, and if you're kind of passionate about what you're doing and you're enjoying it and you're learning and getting something out of it, that is the priority, and then you can kind of figure out and get to some of the other things along the way. So I started out doing totally different things. One of my first few internships I actually got to do with Telemundo in the Bay Area, which is where I grew up. And that is where I got a little bit of the bug for NBC in particular, because I loved that there was this sort of partnership between NBC and Telemundo, and there were opportunities and always a reflection of important stories in the community that I felt were being told where I lived. And I thought, wow, wouldn't it be great one day to be able to work for NBC? And then I went off and did totally different things and got involved in some documentary filmmaking, which I thought I wanted to do too, and then found my way back to NBC through a great program, which is called the News Associates Program, where out of college or grad school you can go and kind of do a different rotation with each of the parts of NBC. So I did some time with nightly news, I did some time in long form, and ultimately I ended up in the investigative unit, which I loved working on. And then a mentor of mine said, hey, have you ever considered becoming a political campaign embed? Because the season is coming, and if it's something that has ever interested you, you're at the right place in your life, which is basically a point where you can live out of a suitcase for 2 years, not see your friends and family necessarily, but cover history, and would you want to do it? And I was like, I'm not really sure. Politics, I don't know. And then I ultimately did it. It was the best decision. It was the best recommendation. So when somebody in your life kind of gives you that advice who's been there, I would say always listen to it, because it can really lead to something incredible. And I was assigned to cover the Hillary Clinton campaign in 2016, and then that's how I found my way here to Washington and covering the Trump administration and now the Biden administration. But truly, if somebody had told me at the beginning of that you're going to end up as a White House correspondent, I would have had no idea how to say, okay, sure, and what is that path? So just give yourself the room to pursue what you enjoy, and the rest will work itself out.
Very good, very good.
That is so fabulous. That resonates with me so deeply in terms of the zigging and the zagging. And in my case, for example, like a non-traditional path into journalism, I actually got my bachelor's degree in psychology at the University of Houston. I thought I wanted to be a therapist. Then I worked for one and said, I don't want to be a therapist. and so, and so I got a bunch of random jobs. I was just telling my daughter the story last night. My first job, I really disliked it. I worked for a temp agency, and a lot of our clients were ex-cons. They were freshly out of prison, and they were trying to get reacclimated into society. We'd have to do drug tests with our, like put on gloves and check their urine. And I knew I didn't want to do that either. So I ended up going to the University of Texas. I was like, I want to take a bunch of random classes that sound interesting, astronomy, journalism, whatever. I ran into a professor there, Rosenthal Alves, who still teaches there from Brazil, great journalist at the age of 15 when he was there. And he became a mentor of mine. He said, go down to the Daily Texan, go report for them in the basement, go down there. And of course, I was like sped over there. I could not, they had a nasty, smelly couch, and I could not get off the couch. I was like so obsessed with all the stories. There was conflict with the president of the university. The UT Tower was opening up after decades of being closed after a mass shooting in the 60s. So I was obsessed. And the next clue, I just caught on a mentor after mentor. The next mentor in journalism told me, business, go into business. You'll always have a job if you cover business journalism. So I went into business journalism. I ended up back working for the Austin American-Statesman in Austin, and I was covering an electric co-op. It's the largest member-owned utility in the country, and a few customers, a source called from the legislature, because I was covering some issues there too, said there's something weird going on over there. And that began a multi-year investigative project where we found out about corruption with the general manager, with the general counsel, with the board. Everyone was ousted. The general manager and the general counsel were both criminally charged. It turned into a crime story. And so that's how I got interested in covering public safety and crime. Lo and behold, I'm out here many years later covering the Capitol, and that turns into a crime story with Jan 6. And of course, I'm like, let's go. I've done this before. And so Jan 6 became my life. The panel did. It's all I feel like I did for at least a year or so. And it's just, it reminds me so much of the zigs and the zags and saying yes and flexing all of these different journalistic muscles and being open to it, because the path will zig and zag. And if you're saying yes along the way, then all of these new opportunities will open up. Like when I was here at Stars and Stripes, I'm still very terrified of television. Like my first hit on CNN, I just wanted to vomit. I did not eat. I somehow survived. And so I made it through, but I kept saying yes to hits, and so that's when NPR, I said yes to them for a hit, and then they called the next day. I thought I had messed something up. And they're like, no, it's about a job. You didn't mess anything up. And so it's just about that zigging and zagging. I just love how you put it, Monica, in terms of just following that path and being open and flexing those muscles. So, to Ed.
Very good.
Thank you.
Great story. Ed?
The one and only time I was ever called into the principal's office was in 7th grade after doing the morning announcements. And he said, can you come into my office? So what did I do? And he sat me down and he says, you're really good at that. And you should consider that as a career one day. I thought, okay, kind of filed that away. And like 2 weeks later, my technology or my shop teacher did the same exact thing. And like Monica said, like Claudia said, you kind of don't see that being said to you. And it took me another however many years to get here now, but like someone was telling me that a long time ago. So I think when you say be open to things and be ready to zig and zag, I wasn't clearly at the time, and it took a little while, but here we are. My journalism career began in like 7th grade, that same year, when I started doing a family newsletter for my family, because my uncle who had lived in Vermont was moving to Wisconsin. And I couldn't fathom him not being able to keep in touch with all of us. And at the same time, I discovered the Microsoft Word newsletter template. And so I started fooling around with it. And for like the next 5 years, until I went to college, I would do like a quarterly newsletter for our family. And only recently did somebody rediscover copies of this, because I would mail them all to all of my like aunts and great aunts and cousins, and I can still remember some of their addresses because of it. And that was how it began. I went to college here in DC at American University because it was the ideal spot to figure out, do I want to be in journalism or do I want to be in public service government work, because that was what I liked. And I was like, well, is this because I want to do that, or is it just because I like tracking it? It's because I like tracking it. I realized that over time. In fact, one of the most profound days, I was on a radio internship in London. I was on a study abroad semester. And it was the day of the Madrid train bombing. And the radio service I was working for was essentially a freelance network that would pair up freelancers all over the world with a news organization if they needed them. So like if NPR needed somebody in Madrid because their Madrid guy was on vacation or on assignment somewhere else, that was the busiest day we had. And it was literally me sitting at a desk, kind of like Jim, coordinating coverage with all sorts of, with CBS radio, with CBC radio, with whoever else. And we found 4 or 5 guys in Madrid that day who were able to provide. And that's when I went home and I said, this is what I want to do. So, you know, and that same semester was sitting in London one day and got an email from a friend, a classmate, Josh Kroshauer, who's now at Axios and the Jewish Insider, saying, the WashingtonPost.com has an internship this summer. Would you be interested? And I thought, well, I'm going to be in DC, sure. Emailed them my resume. You know, if I hadn't been sitting in my email in that one moment in London, wouldn't have seen this, it wouldn't have happened as quickly. But like you, within a day, they had signed me up. And that was it. It was from there, ended up on this totally unforeseen path to where we are today. And part of why, not to shamelessly tie us back to where we are right now, but part of the reason why I'm so sensitive and willing to help organizations like NHFA and NAHJ, the Hispanic Journalists Association, is because it was through going to those conferences over the course of many years that I met people at CBS, first casually, then perhaps with more purpose, and ultimately, the woman who was the recruiter at CBS who had been meeting 5 or 6 years at the conference left, became a TV agent. When I saw she was doing that was when I was thinking about doing this, and I said, well, if you need a client, call me. And you know, it was one of those like, yeah, we should get together and have coffee things. Well, she actually followed up the following week and became my first agent. And lo and behold, here we are. So I owe it all to, you know, organizations like this one and to NAHJ, because without them, you wouldn't have made the right connections necessarily to match the ambition to be where we are. And so it's part of why we're here today.
Yeah. Well, that leads me to the next subject that I wanted to get into, which is representation, which is always an important topic. It's part of the reason why Felix does what he does and brings us together, which is a great thing. And I think a good way to get into it, because it dovetails from the discussion we were just having, is as you were coming up along the way, did you find yourself being sort of the only Latino or Latina in the newsroom? What was that like? Maybe, Claudia, you were in Texas, so there were lots of folks, and it was maybe like 50-50 or 25-75 or something like that. I mean, I worked at different newsrooms along the way where it just sort of depended where I was at. My first TV reporting job was in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I was the only Cuban American, I think, within like a 500-mile radius, probably more than that. So it was a slightly different experience for me and for the people around me, but it changed as I went up, like to places like Chicago and Dallas and stuff like that. But Claudia, what was that like for you? We'll start with you and then kind of move around.
Yeah, that really shaped my experience in Texas. I was just surrounded by so many Latinos and journalists of color. And in a single day, I could use my Spanish, easily going to like a Latino grocery store or working on a story even. It was just a normal part of my everyday life. And I took it for granted until I came out here and I got to the Capitol, and it was just such a shocking experience for me. I don't know if, Ed, you, look at you
I
did.
shook my head because I knew exactly what you meant.
It is like you get on the hill, and it's like, where are all the Latinos? Where is everyone? And so I took organizations for granted like NHJ, and that has been my safe place here in terms of finding other Latinos in journalism and not feeling like I'm on an island and having to work harder to get kind of these bilingual stories put together. Like I get to escape every once in a while, go into member districts, talk to voters, and that's where I can get my Spanish into my pieces. And so out here, I am working a lot harder to get into these organizations, being more active with them, because it feels less lonely in terms of these kind of the hallways we may end up running around. It's not as easy as it felt in Texas in terms of the diversity that I was able to experience there. I don't know if Ed, yeah.
I mean, I'm a far more complex character when it comes to this for a few reasons, but because as the O'Keefe, again, I had a colleague of ours say something to me a few years ago when I was still at the Post that, you know, you're kind of our secret weapon. And I said, what do you mean? He goes, well, they book you on Face the Nation or Inside Politics to talk about everything. They would only book me to talk about immigration. You're lucky. And I said, well, that's not, no, I can't. He's like, no, think about it. And I was like, okay, you're right. So you carry this sort of weird burden of, am I enough, right?
Yes.
We talk about our Latinidad. Well, when you have the last name like I do, and you walk into rooms like this or, you know, different settings, you get this, what are you doing here? Why? 'Cause you're not a Lopez or an Hernandez or an Acosta or a Grisales. And so that's part of it. And it's funny because when I got hired at CBS, I had somebody say, you know, we love watching your work, and you've been great as a contributor, and we get to count you as a Hispanic, they said. I said, what do you mean you get to count me as a Hispanic? I am a Hispanic. Well, how is that? I said, well, my mother. Why do they always forget that? But it happens among Latinos, too. And that's a real problem. We could spend a whole afternoon talking about that even within our own community, it's an issue. I remember working at the Post. There were not many of us then. There are now, a lot more, and especially Latinas, which is fantastic on the national desk. But James Wagner is a sports writer for, is he still at the New York Times, covering baseball? Right. Nicaraguan, I believe. Right. So like me, he's, what's that? Oh, there you go. All right. And I didn't realize he was what I call a Bill Richardson Latino either. And why was he doing so well on the baseball beat? Because he was speaking Spanish to all the players. Well, what has every sports organization and sports network gone out and done now with baseball? But hired Latino people to speak to these guys because they're the only ones they trust.
James' mother would not speak to him unless he spoke to her in Spanish.
There you go. Yeah.
So he didn't speak to her in Spanish.
And what a blessing she gave him then, because look at how it's helped his career. So the New York Times scooped him up when they realized what he was. And he's written some beautiful stories, gone back with the players to the Dominican and to Venezuela and other parts of the world. So he and I were like the Post's two secret, because I was covering immigration and other issues, and I think sometimes there were a lot of people like, why do you care about this so much? I'm like, well, A, it's a congressional story and it's a major policy issue.
Right.
But B, I had an understanding of this that, you know, other reporters didn't. You tell the story about no Latinos on Capitol Hill. Back in 2012, I think it was, when Boehner was trying to cut the deal and the Senate was working on it, one day Jorge Ramos showed up at Boehner's weekly press conference. And, or maybe it was Harry Reid's weekly press. Either way, I walked into the room and I said under my breath, what on earth is Jorge Ramos doing here? And this aide to Harry Reid heard me say it. Latina from Nevada, didn't realize that O'Keefe was Hispanic. She did her homework, she figured it out, and she found me about a week later. She goes, you're one of us, aren't you? And I said, yes, I am. And it opened up this door, because turns out, and especially now, they're in all the leadership offices, they're on all the committees. So there's a network of us out there. But it took that extra, just me saying under my breath, what is Jorge Ramos doing here today? For her to realize that I knew who he was and how big a deal it was. And then the cheese may poured out. So you know, representation is a real advantage and a real issue. And you know, I spent a lot of time thinking about it for all the reasons my colleague said you were the secret weapon. And you know, CNN and NBC have these fantastic bilingual situations, right? Because you've got sister networks and whatnot, and you operate in both languages. And the only time I remember doing that at the Post was we code-shared a debate with Univision, I'm going to say it correctly. And we were down in Miami preparing, and they split a workroom between the Post and Univision as everyone was getting ready. And I turned to one of my editors, I said, "Do you hear that?" It was in Spanish and English and English and Spanish. I said, "That's the future." And he goes, "What?" And I go, "That's the future." So.
It's so funny because I think the biggest honor is when I get to do some things on Telemundo in Spanish. But I had this experience years ago where I was covering Iowa as an embed, and I was doing something for Telemundo, and I realized, like, I don't know the word for caucus in Spanish. Like, there's a vocabulary I grew up with my parents who are from Mexico, and as a first-generation American, I learned an excellent amount of Spanish, but I didn't have the Iowa, you know, election vocabulary lesson necessarily. So there are things that you realize that you can do and communicate, and then there's like very specific things that you're like, no, I need to study up and like know exactly what I'm talking about. But getting to do some of those things and actually report in Spanish, which I got to do, you know, in Europe, traveling with President Biden, like it's a thing that probably makes my parents the most proud, and that I enjoy doing the most. But I have this experience all the time where, exactly, on paper, you know, they may see Ed O'Keefe, they see me and my face sometimes, and then I speak in Spanish, and everybody's like, whoa, 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 where did that come from? Like, and I'm, oh, my family, my parents are from Mexico, and they're like, you don't look Mexican. And it's always like, what does that mean? Like, you don't look X, you don't look this, like, how do you know? Or what, I'm telling you also that I am. And there's always this a little bit like, this kind of mystery and this game that you play of like, well, I am actually 100%
Surprise,
Mexican.
yeah.
And it's this, and then, but it is kind of like a little bit of a secret weapon because you really can use it to better understand, to better communicate. Certainly at the White House over the last many years, like covering the issue of immigration, it allows you to bring this humanity and understanding to an incredibly complex issue. And I think that is where in our newsrooms, we can be a critical resource because you can help your colleagues who may just not have enough of a grasp on some of it understand why language and words matter so much when you're covering something like that, and why we're talking about real human beings, many of them fleeing the most horrible of circumstances, and why that context is so important to always bring, again, to these conversations that become then very political, very sometimes charged. So I always seek to do that, but that is definitely one of the tougher things to do, but one of the most important. And then also getting our newsrooms to realize, which I think NBC does very well, that immigration isn't the only issue Latinos care about. Obviously, it may be a big one that also non-Latinos care about and focus on, but that we have to remember that the community is so much more, and that obviously the diverse, you know, communities within being Latino, and how obviously being Latino, it's not a monolith. All of that, those messages I think are so important to reflect. And when you talk about representation, that only gets amplified, and the more of that, the better.
Yeah.
And you know, Jim, where it's really mattered in more recent years, and we may not have appreciated it until this happened, but if we look at the Pulse shooting in Orlando and Uvalde, and then what happened at the El Paso and Walmart, or the Walmart in El Paso, who were the victims of those? But predominantly Latinos.
Right.
And who were the family members left behind to talk about them, but Spanish-speaking parents and grandparents. And so certain news organizations, I'll say it, mine included, hit roadblocks in trying to tell the stories of these people after the fact, because you didn't have the correct cultural awareness or language capability to go knock on the door. why was Maria Elena Salinas so successful at getting people to talk to ABC? But because she could show up in Uvalde, go knock on a door, and the abuelita knew exactly who she was, or at least appreciated that she spoke Spanish, and she spilled their guts to them. So that's where it is not just about, when you think about how this matters and why it's important to have Monica and Claudia and Jim and I covering Washington and doing it in front of the camera, how so much more critical it is on almost everything to ensure that it's happening behind the scenes, because it's those people that are not only making the editorial decisions, but also executing the journalism that we can't necessarily do from in front of a camera. But it was a real stark reminder that producers, bookers, cameramen, you have to, in these communities, do this. And it's a reality that, to the point that it's not just about immigration. Every issue is a Latino issue. And if you can't cover every issue as a Latino issue, your news organization's going to have some trouble.
Yeah, if I could add, our organization, it seemed, I just had the perfect timing in terms of that phone call they made to bring me on, because they were going through a reckoning a little more than 4 years ago in terms of the lack of Latino representation in these high-profile desks, including the Washington desk. There were no Latinos. And so right before me, about a month before me, they hired Franco Ordonez for the White House. I joke he's my brother from another mother, because we're both Colombian Americans who were I was born in Chicago, he was in New York, and we grew up in the South. And so he was a month before me. I came that summer of 2019, and now we have 5 Latinos on the desk. 3 of them Colombian Americans somehow. So just on our desk out of 35 people, and it is such a reckoning. Like when Uvalde happened, I was able to raise my hand too, and they were able to let me go and go down there and help with that coverage, because it was so important, especially when you're dealing with Spanish-speaking interviews. You really want to get that story, that full story out in terms of the nuances of language and culture and what have you. And so it's just incredible, just like my network alone, looking at where we've come just in the last 4 or so years, there has been a realization there that we need to put Latinos in all sorts of beats, not just immigration, but all sorts of beats, and make sure we're represented and can tell that story to our communities.
Yeah.
So.
Those are great stories. And I mean, I can just relay a couple of things that I went through. I mean, when I was at another network a while back, I don't want to mention any names. It was said to me by an executive, was English your first language? And there was another network executive, different network executive, who later on said, we don't really think of you as Hispanic. So my experiences sort of ran the gamut. With a lot of comments in between. So you do encounter these obstacles along the way, but it's refreshing to hear a lot of you talk about your ethnicity, your background, your heritage as being a secret weapon, because that's encouraging to me to see this evolution away from, oh, you're the guy here that we hired because of diversity reasons and that sort of thing, versus now you're an asset. You're one of our people that we send out there when we need to get the job done on certain stories. But in addition to that, on every story. And people like Monica, Ed, Claudia, you're all excelling in your career, not because of your last name or despite your last name in Ed's case, but because you are tenacious champions for the truth. And that is something to be celebrated. And we're all very proud of you. And the other thing I will say, just based on my own experience, because I was covering a lot of the immigration stuff over at the White House under Obama and under Trump, but it got a little bit more attention during Trump, is there are a lot of organizations like Felix's all across the country. I did a speech down in San Antonio for the San Antonio Hispanic Journalists Association. And when I got there, I was blown away. They were, because of the Trump experience and the way we were being treated at CNN and so on, they had all of these ladies dressed up in traditional dresses, and they were playing music, and they had these signs up that said, no fake news, Viva Jim, stuff like that. And I only share that because there are so many people out there across the country who are so appreciative of journalists like you. And if you're thinking of coming up in this business, journalists like yourselves, because, like Ed was saying a few moments ago, they're counting on us to be there, counting on us to ask the questions that matter, counting on us to tell the truth. And, you know, there's an expectation that you need to do your job. You're not looking out for us if you're not doing your job. And that's important to me too. I think of my abuela, who watched a lot of Univision into the late hours. There was this guy in the middle of the night. He was like a palm reader or something. I remember her. That, you know who I'm talking about? Who's that guy? Yeah, that's it. Oh my God! I remember staying up with her late at night watching that. Okay, everybody knows. See, this is a cultural thing that we all share. Forgive me for not knowing his name. There's a little Sábado Gigante in my house from time to time and stuff like that. But anyway, that's the other reason why I think we have to be there and not worry so much what our last name is or what our skin tone is, or are we Hispanic enough or too Hispanic, or just go out there, be who you are, and be tenacious and fight for the truth. That's what everybody wants. It doesn't matter where you come from or who you are. We can all get the job done on every story. It doesn't have to be on immigration. So let me ask you all in the audience, if you because I don't want to run out of time and not give anybody a chance to ask a question. But does anybody have a question that you want to ask? Yes, sir.
I'd like to thank you so much for being here. I'd like to talk about representation, of course, and also misrepresentations. My community has been misrepresented for the longest time, especially in the late years. I'm right from the border. I live by the border wall in South Texas. We do bike rides in the parks next to the border wall, right? So we know kids play next to the border wall. We know there's families and community. So about misrepresenting communities, how do you guys represent that truth of the Latino communities that have been lied about, right, or portrayed a different way?
Yeah.
And we all know it's not necessarily true all the time.
Well, I mean, I will say, you know, that was one of the things that I was up against when I was covering Trump, because I covered him in the 2016 campaign. And of course, when he first came out and announced he was running for president, he described people coming across the border as rapists and killers and drug dealers and everything else. And it was like, okay, this is what we're going to be dealing with here. And that went right into when he went into the White House, a lot of that stuff went right into the White House. And I felt like it was my responsibility to make sure, hey, we got to ask the tough questions on this. Some of the stuff that you're saying is absolutely racist, and you have to be called out on it. Like, there's just, what are we supposed to do? Like, tiptoe around the tulips here and not ask these questions? When you say it's an invasion, that's like what? You know, these states along the border have not been captured by Mexico or something like that. I mean, the rhetoric just got totally out of control. And it's a difficult and tricky balancing act, and I guess I'll put the question to our panel here and ask, how do we cover this issue? How do we talk about the migrants who are bussed from the border up to places like New York City, and the mayor of New York City, Eric Adams, saying, well, you know, New York City might be destroyed, or whatever he said the other day, because of these migrants here. How do we cover it? Do we cover it in a cold and clinical way without really showing our feelings or our thoughts on the subject? How do we do this?
And I think one of the main things that we try to do is to go there and be there and not tell the story from Washington only. And there is absolutely a political angle to what is being talked about, with differing views and, of course, extremes that you see from certain sides of this situation that are important to put into the political context as we get into an election year. Certainly that will become even more critical. But I think what I so appreciate about my colleagues, and I think about Jose Diaz-Balart and my colleagues who go down there and spend a lot of time and actually report from there and are talking to migrants and are talking to residents and are trying to help the viewer understand, you know, when some of the, you know, when the Title 42 was going to lift, the challenges around just local cities, El Paso, on the ground there, and really helping people understand, A, the plight of what migrants were facing to try to get across the border, B, what the local community, in terms of the shelters that were there and the people who are running these shelters and what they try to do, and C, like, again, the political angle of many politicians who go down to the border to kind of use that as a backdrop for an event and for a message and then get out of there and aren't necessarily, there as much as some of these other key players are. And so I think the important thing is to just keep going back there and to be on the ground. And that when you have people who are there who are bilingual and can interview somebody in real time and kind of translate it in real time and communicate to the viewer, I think that is sometimes in television a little bit of the challenge, because you're thinking, okay, I have this certain amount of airtime, I really want to hear what people are saying, but I need to account for translating it and all of that. Doing it quickly and live and in the moment, I think, is one of the best ways to do it. And I think at NBC, we do endeavor to do that. And that has been a very good way to try to tell the story. But I would also say it's about going there when it's not just Title 42 lifting, or when there's going to be something that seems to be this big moment. It's about being there in these other months as well. And I think we have continued to cover it from every aspect. But there's nothing that beats being on the ground and talking to the people who are most invested.
Yeah, I feel like that's where I've experienced kind of my best stories, is when I go there. For example, I was in Florida a few weeks ago. I got obsessed with Florida for a while through different stories about Latinos. The most recent one was about the immigration law there, and anecdotal evidence that Latinos were leaving the state out of fear that they could be detained, et cetera. And so I was able to go to a flea market and talk to people there, and just Spanish now for me is just utter music when I can get it, especially into a piece, and I can have people tell their stories. That's what they're most comfortable speaking in, if it's Spanish, is getting that in the story and telling their story about how they're losing at the flea market, they're losing customers, my business is down 40%, 80%, 90%, whatever it was. And telling those stories just basically from the front lines. And like another one I'm struggling with in terms of the Capitol is that beat has shifted in terms of how much misinformation we have to deal with now on the Hill. And one piece of misinformation is that migrants, Latinos, are the ones bringing fentanyl into the country. That is not true. And so that's another story I'm hoping to get at in terms of just trying to expose that truth. And again, as Monica said, going there seems to be the key to interview people on the ground.
But your concern was that where are you from? Okay, so Hidalgo, McAllen, Brownsville, Laredo, El Paso, all of them, your concern is the perception is that your communities are overrun by the thousands who cross every day, when in reality you can go run your errands, take your kids to school, go for a run, and it's like a normal community. Okay. Television journalism especially is guilty of not pulling back far enough on every issue. And I think whether it's crime in Chicago, border security, the Ukraine war and the size and scope of where that battle is happening, we all need to work on using graphics, using, well, I mean more giving people the sense of space. That we need to be able to pull back and say, this is happening on this block in this city, but El Paso otherwise is a community like any other in the United States. Yes, the crime is happening in this part of Chicago for whatever reason, but it's not happening here. The war in Ukraine is happening in this corner of Ukraine, but this country, bigger than Texas, is otherwise, to some extent, operating, not normal, but peacefully. It's not just us, and it's not just border stuff. It's a lot of television. I've learned in my 5.5 years that I think we need to think about and do a better job of pulling back, again, using maps or using a little more geographic context and saying, yes, it is happening here in this part of the city or in this part of the border, but it's an 800-mile long border, and they only come to about 10 miles of it because these are the 10 easiest miles to get to. Yeah. But I hear a lot of that from sources and friends in Texas. Oh my gosh, it's happening again. I'm walking to dinner right now and everything's fine, thank you very much, but if I turn on your channel, it doesn't look like it. But it's not
Part of it, though, is we have to fact check these the politicians, if they're going to play fast and loose with the facts and demonize your community, other communities along the border, and portray this picture that is not true. We have to call it out. And I think that's part of our job, too, even if it gets us in a little hot water every now and then. Does anybody else have a question? Yes, sir.
Great panel, great conversation. We were talking about beats. Earlier we talked about baseball, the impact that we made in baseball, touched on public safety. I think in the last decade, about half of all new businesses, for example, are concerned about beats, and that maybe a little trying to get into the industry could focus on a beat and really make some impact? What do you think those beats can be?
I think in the political realm, the beat has gotten a lot better in terms of representation. I mean, I think that has changed just in the last several years. I mean, I remember when I was doing live shots at the White House, and it was me, Jim Avila. You know, we had two Latinos doing, you know, White House correspondent live shots in the briefing room. That was pretty good. And lately, we've seen, I think, some really great images coming out of the briefing room of all women White House correspondents sort of standing in the briefing room doing live shots. So I think it is getting away from that old boys club that it used to be. I think sports is probably one of those areas where you do need to see better representation. I kind of wish I would see more Latinos and Latinas on ESPN. I watch it, and maybe they think because we got Deportes, we don't need it, but like regular, you know, there's sort of a perception in our line of work, and maybe, I don't know if Felix feels the same way about this, but I think there's a little bit of perception maybe at the executive level with, oh, if we have the Spanish-speaking platform, we've taken care of our diversity over here. Okay, well, there's a lot of folks out there who want to watch English language television, but want to see better representation at that level as well. So I think it has to be spread out. But in terms of beats, I mean, what do you think? Maybe the Pentagon? There may be certain beats where, yeah, I think, yeah, we do need to see healthcare for sure, absolutely. Business reporting. What's that? Small business. Yeah, business.
I think COVID revealed also a little bit where there was an opportunity here to try to make sure misinformation was a big issue as well when it came to the vaccines and things like that. And in particular, a lot of people in the Latino community were maybe getting what they thought was news from sources that weren't necessarily news, that was kind of spreading things that weren't true. And so it was really important, we felt, to make sure that everybody was getting the correct information. But I know that that's a major challenge kind of in dealing with that in particular, especially in an election cycle. But I think the pandemic also revealed that in terms of trying to reach different people where they are and how they feel about certain medical or health issues, that there was probably a lot of work to be done in that space too, that hopefully that opened up the realization so people have been able to do and direct more resources towards it. But I think that was a revealing moment in that sense.
Yeah, I would say in South Florida, what I'm hearing a lot of is that people are struggling in terms of fighting against misinformation. There's a lot of Spanish language radio there.
That's a huge issue right now in South Florida.
Huge issue, and there's just not enough journalists covering that in terms of what's getting carried through, going viral, and it's completely false. And that's a really good example. There's other pockets around the country where this is happening, in Texas, New Mexico, California. And so that's a major issue where coverage, in terms of bilingual coverage, is really critical in terms of addressing that kind of misinformation out there, especially with an election year.
They're targeting people like my abuela, who would stay up until midnight watching the guy that would tell your fortune. But anyway, that's what they're doing. They're going after elderly. They want elderly folks to be misinformed. Does anybody? I think you had a question, ma'am.
Good morning. Thank you so much for being here. My question is, if you could share your thoughts on technology and how it's evolving and impacting our engagement with audiences and also our careers. There's been discussions about the impact of AI. My background is in public diplomacy and international relations and journalism, and so I'm keen to hear your thoughts about technology. We see the trend, from traditional.
They better not AI us before we have a chance to have better representation. Espérate. I mean, you better hold your horses right there. That is not going to fly. I don't know, Ed. What do we think about technology?
Well, in terms of
you went from newspapers to television,
right, so
there's an evolution.
It's been we're all essentially digital journalists now.
Yeah, that's true.
Yes.
I think
Very
that's
true.
the first misnomer that has to be struck is we're all available across multiple platforms. You are a multi-platform journalist if you're doing this, whether you like it or not. I think in the technology space, when it comes to the Latino community, to keep in mind is we are prone to use different apps or modes of communication than maybe other audiences. We're much more prone to be on WhatsApp, right? I've heard we over-index on Hulu, for example, for whatever reason. Black Twitter is a thing. I don't think Latino or Spanish Twitter was as big a thing. but we do well in Facebook, right? We're still pretty hot on Facebook. I'm looking at Chuck, who does a lot of micro-targeting. So I think we just, and then how it's changing our work, not only is there the debate of do we need to be on all these platforms, but should we, if misinformation is helping them profit and expand their reach? And how much time do we need to be out there sharing what we do, reported actual factual information, and putting it in the same space alongside, what is essentially, falsehoods. So it is revolutionizing how we do our jobs, because some days they may say to us, or they may say to me, okay, you're going to do the evening news tonight. We need you on the streaming network at 5 o'clock. And would you mind doing this quick explainer for the social media team that will end up on TikTok and Instagram?
That's true. With technology,
Right.
that means you got to be ready to do everything.
Right.
That's the thing.
And yet, you may get more feedback on doing that little video that you thought was going to be seen by nobody. And is it that because there's more engagement there? Is it because it's being seen by more people? I don't know, but it's
Could
another
get
way that
picked
we're
up
doing
by
our
the
job.
far right and
Right. Yeah.
turn you into
Yeah.
pinata or something.
I've raised my hand at work to try and cover AI on the Hill as much as possible because I'm trying to understand it and the impact it could have on our business. There's a whole range of reactions when you look at media outlets. When I was traveling in Florida, I was surprised to pull up the Miami Herald site, and McClatchy has been pretty active in terms of using AI. It said they organize their homepage with the help of AI. Whereas I compare it to NPR, where I'm at, and the union is in active talks with management to say, do not touch AI without talking to us first. Let's make sure this is an open conversation. So NPR is moving into it very slowly. So time will tell in terms of what role it can play. It can make us more efficient. For example, I go back to the days when I had an internship with Reuters in New York City for a little bit when I started out. And we used to write these earnings reports. It would take less than 15 to write those. Now you can have an AI bot writing that out, and it can make you more efficient to work on stories that are more meaningful rather than plugging in, what happened to a stock price and profit that quarter for a company. So this is a very critical time to watch how media outlets deal with it, to get a sense how it will impact our business. The hope is it will be for the best, but each company will approach it differently, and we'll see who in the end does it right.
And Chuck Roca had a question.
Yeah, it struck me as we were talking about this, I've been running campaigns for over 30 years, and when we think about folks, and I've been honored to be booked on all of your shows and be on TV and be on all of these programs, but what I was thinking about when we were having a discussion is when Ed O'Keefe calls me and wants me to quote something or wants me to be on CBS, it's normally around me being a national senior Democratic office about what's going on today. How does this affect overall politics? When Jim has me on CNN, it's the same thing. If Alicia Menendez calls me and we need to be on this weekend, it's about this national news thing. But when a Latino's not involved, and a white reporter or a white news outlet reaches out to me, to Ed's point, it's about how does this affect the Latino vote, which now has become a bigger part of the electorate. It's a much bigger part of who controls a lot of the narrative. And especially when I've been on NPR, probably the most is around this national thing, right? But I think the question is with the lack of representation at the operative level, at my level, and we've all had these conversations, some of you at my dinner table, when we talk about the lack of representation at the most senior level of government, senior level of media, and in campaigns, and Ed's heard me talk about this ad nauseum, is there's no representation for our community at the most senior level of either party. Right? The presidential campaign is a set-aside because there's lots of spotlights on that. But of the top 50 congressional and Senate races in the last election, there were only 2 minority managers. One was black, and one was a Latino. And that's in the top 50 races. No strategist or operative. So when you start losing that, and there's not somebody representing us on TV talking about public policy that affects the border wall, that affects public policy, which is healthcare, I think that's where we start losing that representation. I give y'all kudos because you're very intentional about who you book. But it's such a microcosm of a small part of the media when the larger narrative still sees us as the brown kids talking about immigration.
Well, I do think there's a lot to be said for that, Chuck. And my personal view is, and I should note, Congressman Joaquin Castro has come into the room. Hello, Congressman. And this is in no way a segue. But I do think being somebody who's a little bit longer in the tooth, I'm a little shocked that we don't have more Latinos running for president. I mean, we don't have a lot of Latinos or Latinas running political campaigns, although with the Biden campaign, that's happening this time around. There's a lot of representation in the leadership of that campaign. But Ed, what is, not to put you on the spot,
Well, I knew you'd
but
do
why
that, Jim.
is it, but why, where, we had Julian Castro back in 2020.
We had Bill Richardson.
Bill Richardson, but
And,
that's going back a ways.
and again, well, let me get to Bill Richardson in a second, but
Yeah.
then we talk about being in positions of power. I'd be remiss to not call out the fact that CBS News is now run by Ingrid Ciprian Matthews, whose first language was Spanish because
Very
she was
good.
born in the Dominican.
NBC News is also run.
And
by
NBC run by Cesar
Cesar
Conde.
Conde,
Yep.
that's true.
And
that's
our
true.
streaming network, NBC News Now, is run by a Latina, Janelle Rodriguez.
Yep.
Yeah.
And we've got a Washington bureau chief who's Cuban American. Our political director, Finn, is Latino. Our New York bureau chief. You know, we are in better shape than we've ever been. And it is beginning to be reflected, I hope, better in bookings and in other coverage. As to Chuck's long simmering concerns, I mean, we can only, I'm kind of with Jim, you know, we can only call that out so much. I think it is telling that there aren't more, why is it that, I'm going to light a fuse here, but why is it that more Latino Republicans have run for president than Latino Democrats? You know, what does that say about our politics, which is an entirely different conversation with a different organization? But we have to call that out and be aware of it as well. Richardson, I think, was probably the community's best shot back in the day because of his experiences. But he had the same exact challenge he admitted that he was told by the Kerry campaign, you're not going to be the running mate because Latinos don't realize you're Latino, right? Because he was an Irish Mexican. And this Irish Guatemalan and him talked about this a few times, that there were limits. And, you know, he, I think, was at peace with it because he'd had a very good and successful life. But the limitation was there and was called out by non-Latinos, and yet they had a point. They called us out on it, and it's true. And I think we, as a broader community, have to be accepting of the fact that your last name doesn't have to be Castro. You know, you don't have to be this brown. You can be a little lighter, or you can be a lot darker, and still be considered among the community. And so this is a much broader
We'll have to do another
conversation,
panel.
and it's books, and it's it's a lot. But
Yeah.
Chuck, I hear you, and yes, we are much more intentional about it than some of our colleagues. And I can tell you that at least in my newsroom, I'm pushing every day to make sure that we're booking the guest because they're the expert. That they happen to be Latino is also great. But yes, Latinos should be there on issues other than immigration or other on just Latinos in politics.
Well, thanks, guys, very much. I think we have to wrap it up. Sorry, Monica. But all of you were wonderful. Monica, Claudia, Ed, let's give them all applause. Big round of applause. They were terrific.